So this is a different type of video that I normally wouldn't. I do like philosophy, but this is a different type of video. Uh, I've gone through a bunch of things after saying I'd come out with more videos, but even more things happened after I made that video. So I've been dealing with that. I'm sorry for that. A lot of unexpected issues like car issues, job bogging me down, and just potential financial instability, or at least a perceived one. More of a better safe than sorry, guys. So I just kind of been chilling. But to get into it, uh, this is the only video so far that I've actually wrote kind of a script for, but it's gonna be a bunch of rambling. And I've all right to start. Protagoras. I've been reading Protagoras by Plato, which features Socrates, of course, either imaginary or not imaginary, whatever you think. Uh, and he talks to Protagoras, and Protagoras is a great sophist or sophist. I don't know how to say it, but he is basically a person that teaches young people how to be a good person, or basically teach them how to be a man, so on and so forth. And he gets paid for it. And he's one of the most famous ones. He's the first one. Some argue he's the inventor of philosophy itself, which, I mean, there's some reason to that. But the premise is that a trusted friend of Socrates essentially comes to him and says, wakes him up in the middle of the morning and says, "Hey, Protagoras is in town, and I want to go and pay him to be a good man. And I thought I would tell you because I respect you, and I want to watch you have a dialogue with him, but I more importantly want to know what you think." So Socrates immediately, and for some background, Plato doesn't like the Sophists at all, and he claims that Socrates doesn't like the Sophists. But again, it's debatable if Socrates is a person or just a character in his writing. So he doesn't like them because they allege to be something and then demand payment for it, and he doesn't agree with that. So essentially, Socrates is told that Protagoras is going to teach him how to be a good man, or teach him the values of virtue. And virtue is a very big thing in ancient Greek philosophy, is because they argued a lot about virtue. They wanted to know what was virtuous, what the gods thought was virtuous, and a lot of Plato's writing in relation to Socrates is using his Socratic method and having critical thinking and saying, well, what is virtue? How do we know what virtue is? And a lot of, not a lot of the writing, basically all of the writing amounts to looking for that answer. So Socrates, of course, says, "Sure, I'm going to help you," because that's just what he does. He's a good guy, apparently. He doesn't want anything either. But firstly, he has a conversation with him, and he says, "Why would you even pay him for knowledge? Because knowledge is different. Instead of paying for something, say like food, or paying for something that you would like a painting or something like that." And his example is, well, food. If you buy food, you can store it away and wait to use it. And if the food spoils, you don't have to eat it. And if you don't like the food, you can get rid of it, and so on and so forth. And you possess the food and things like that. And that's basically his argument against paying for knowledge, because when you get taught knowledge or virtue, which this knowledge virtue thing is going to be very critical to the entire book, is because Socrates, spoiler, thinks that virtue is a matter of knowledge and ignorance. And that's what he's going to try to explain further on in the book. And essentially, he says, when you absorb knowledge, you absorb it directly to the soul, whether it's good or bad. And I do agree. There was a point in time where I had consumed a lot of motivational speakers and a lot of that stuff, and I ended up being very positive, but it was a toxic positivity where I prioritize working hard, and I prioritize being overly positive, and uh trying to be accountable for everything and things of this nature. And it's something like that, is no matter what happens, if you don't sit there and process it, or you don't sit there and you think about it, knowledge is absorbed directly into the soul, especially for people that want to hear that, or want somebody to agree with them, or don't have guidance, or don't have a passion or something to pursue, or don't really know what's going on, which is mostly everybody. Nobody really knows what's going on. We're all just kind of bambling forward and pretending we do when we become adults. So essentially, that's what he's getting at, is that when you buy food, if it spoils, you can get rid of it, you can store the food. all this other thing, and knowledge isn't like that. Modern day life gurus are similar in this manner of uh giving knowledge and teaching virtue and how it could be harmful because they say I've done X, Y, and Z. And to step quickly here, you could even say like motivational speakers are similar, but I think that motivational speakers before the era of life gurus or YouTube life gurus were literally people that went out to schools and gave motivational speeches after something critical happened in their life to give a sort of hope to people, not to tell people what to do, but to give them advice and try to get them to see the hopefulness in life to prevent things like suicide or mental illness and things like that. But at some point, I forget what the guy's name is, but there was a motivational speaker in quotations that talked about mostly business, and he came up from the dirt. The older guy, but he was in the early days of YouTube, and he popped off, and that sort of life guru thing started happening, and I think it started with him. That kind of progresses into this toxic manosphere that we have now in this climate of they're aimless men who feel like they're depressed, suicidal, or don't know what's going on, or feel like they're being phased out, or like girls don't like them, and it lures them in and tries to say, "Hey, I can teach you how to be successful. I can teach you how to get women. I can teach you where to go in life. I can teach you all these things." It's essentially the modern day sophist or sophist. They want you to learn from them, but really they want you to pay. And I would say that the modern day one is worse than the previous one because previous one, as you'll know later, they will just say, "Okay, you don't want to learn, then don't pay me and get away from me." It's very different now, where when you watch something, that's a currency in itself. It's a currency just to have your attention. It's a currency just to get that view. It's a currency just to get that like. It's a currency just to get that comment. It's a currency just to share it. It's a currency just to talk about them, good or bad, which is very different from now and then. So sophists basically are people who want to teach people to be good men or virtuous. And that point is that people want to be successful now and then. Back then, they wanted to be successful because a good man was successful, a virtuous man was successful, especially in the eyes of God. And now, or in the of the gods back then. And now, being a good man, being virtuous, it's really coincided with being successful, knowing your values, knowing what you need to do, know what's going to support your eventual family in the future, because that's what you want. Support your habits, do these things. It's about being successful. It's been about being successful from now back to then. It's always been about being successful. And I think like Socrates, they just feed on people that don't know what's going on, and it's really potentially harmful for other people. So Socrates eventually talks over this point with the person. They have a dialogue between the two where he says, "I get what you're saying, and that's why I really want you to talk to him to see if what you're saying matches up with what he actually does or things like that. I want you to prove it to me because even though I respect you, Socrates, I want to evaluate it on my own and I want to know and think critically about it. I want you to go and talk to him to prove your point. Otherwise, why would I take your opinion over his just because I like you? That isn't very, it's not very critical of him." So when they get there, there's like some dialogue about not letting them in because he's so popular or something, which doesn't matter. And then they eventually get in, and there's like 21 people there, and they're all goading them into having a conversation. And Socrates has this way, and I will say it's very passive aggressivist, where he puts the person up and puts himself lower and acts like this benevolent, ignorant person. So he really hypes Protagoras up, and which rightfully so, he does deserve it because at this point he's way older than Socrates. He's one of the oldest sophists. He's one of the most legendary. So it kind of goes as a form of respect, but also you can take it as him belittling him. The first question is Socrates asks him, "How do you teach virtue? I don't think virtue is teachable. So how do you teach virtue?" And one of his examples is because they go back and forth, and he basically says, "I'm able to do it." Blah blah blah. Here are some examples, and those examples aren't too important. But what Socrates says is that I don't think you can teach virtue because imagine there is he names actual people with actual children, but imagine a hypothetical where there's a successful man and then he has a child and he teaches this child to be successful. Uh that doesn't actually translate. Let's say the child isn't successful. That is essentially what he's saying is how can virtue be taught if you can have a a man that's a great man, that's a good politician, that has all these things, he has virtue. Then he has a child, and the child isn't virtuous at all. They actually, in the example, they give the child back and say he's a lost cause. And a real life example of that is being fed with a golden spoon all the time to keep you afloat, or being so big you can't fail, is not having success or being virtuous. Example. It's actually just being pushed along because they don't want you to fail. You can't, you, uh, it's not that you can't, it's that by teaching him these things, it implies that you can't teach virtue if it's possible. There's a possibility that it can fail, essentially. And he proves that, well, you can't teach it because of that. So Protagoras has to spawn. And he says that virtue is made up of multiple different things. And he has to teach a lot of different things in order for all of them to come together. He lists like five things, but more importantly, it it tends to the conversation tends to go around justice and courage, or just being good and things like that. And courage is the big contender point because their examples keep going back and forth with courage. Protagoras says you can have a lot of things, but you can still be a coward. And being a coward isn't being virtuous. So even if you had justice and all these other things, if you're a coward, then you're not virtuous. And this is one of the most not one of the most more important things that he says in the dialogues, at least Socrates, is that essentially he says, well, actually, before I go there, Protagoras has like 4 page of dialogue and tells this mythos story about how virtue was created and things happened involving the gods and stuff. And he's a great big storyteller. But this is an important part in the story because Socrates, in response, says, "Hey, man, sorry, I'm actually falling behind here. You tell such grand stories and you go on for so long, I actually lose my train of thought and I can't keep up." Now everybody around them knows that Socrates is being facetious. He's doing it purposely. He's saying, "Hey, can you stop going on for so long because I don't get a chance to go, and I think you're distracting everybody by telling these grand tales." And this is a big part of Plato's work, where he says that the Sophists do this often, where they essentially say, they tell these grand tells to like really get like gas themselves up and be super fancy and get you attracted, and they're more storytellers than they are arguers because they're just going to start telling stories. And Socrates says, I don't want you to tell stories, I want you to be direct, I want you to answer my questions and have us let us have a dialogue between each other where we can get to the conclusion point, because I want to work together with you in order to get to the conclusion, because I don't think virtue can be taught, but you think it can be taught. And I want to either be proven right or wrong in this context. I don't want you to tell me a story. I want you to answer my question. I know you're capable of doing that. And if you are such a capable teacher, which eventually he goes back and says, well, I'm not able to do that. Socrates says, well, if you're such a capable teacher, you should be able to slow down to my pace and match what I'm saying, because that would prove how great and grand you are. And this is kind of an important part because he's digging into him, but more importantly, this is how Socrates gets people to engage with him, by engaging in his Socratic method. So he basically, like a big baby, says, I'm gonna walk off if you don't agree. And everybody around is like, oh, I agree, and they go back and forth, and it shows the effect that these two people have on the group of the 21, of the values that they have taught them, and how they argue for the point of them staying. So they eventually start talking and they resort to the Socratic method. And because they resort to the Socratic method, Socrates, in response to him saying virtue is made of multiple different things, he tries to say, is it like the parts of a golden object which are fused together are many things, like features of a face that form a whole while retaining their individual substance? Protagoras says that it's a second thing. They're all their own individual thing, but they form a face, so they form virtue. But these things, bravery, kindness, wisdom, they all form together to make virtue, which is like a face. And Socrates, of course, and Protagoras essentially doesn't answer the question, and then tries to hide it and like get the crowd going. And this is another thing where Sophists will get the crowd going instead of getting you going in an argument. They're trying to make a spectacle. They're not trying to they're not trying to engage, even though they're capable of, their mind is somewhere else. They're focused on engaging you. They're focused on making you be attracted to what they're saying, making you follow the storytelling, making you feel like, wow, he's really spitting right now. He's really saying some stuff. So essentially, sophists will fill your head with way too much. When retorting to you and saying stuff, they'll talk a bunch of bullshit essentially. They'll say a bunch of bullshit and they'll fill your head and they won't give you a chance to speak. And that's exactly what modern day life gurus do when they're pressed on their topics or when they're even talking in a normal video. They'll start talking about a lot of bullshit. And I do want to, I mean, we're 15 minutes in or so. I do want to brief here that Plato actually respects Protagoras, respects Protagoras. He doesn't respect Sophists, but he respects Protagoras. And I will say, if you've gotten this far, at the end, they do come to a mutual agreement, and it does prove that sophists are capable of doing what they set out to be. They're just very driven by that money aspect, and they're very. And he thinks that's backwards. He thinks that how could you be virtuous? I don't want to actually paraphrase or anything. In my opinion, I think he thinks how can you be virtuous and claim to be teaching virtues when you pry on people, you prey on people and demand money from them when you could just be giving it out, and that would be worthy in the eyes of the gods. And life gurus especially, they claim that they need to explain all these points and do all these things, and you need all these different aspects of success in order to have success. You need to work hard. You need to grind every day. You need to be constantly worrying about how much money you have, constantly worrying about what people think about you, constantly doing just a bunch of different things, and all of those are the key to success. Those are the keys to success. They want to give you the key to success, but they need to teach you how to get the key of success. Essentially, you need these multiple different things, and that's essentially what Protagoras is saying. The sophists, they believe that virtue is made up of a whole bunch of individual things that give you the whole, which is success. And they then again, they don't like being short and concise. They do like going on, which I can't say anything because I think I love philosophy and I talk about it, and I'm 18, 15, 20 minutes into a video. Well, Socrates, of course, contests this, and again, what I was saying way before, I kind of jumped ahead. He says you can have like four of them, but if you don't have the one, and the example being courage, you're not virtuous. Socrates is what he says something. I won't say it's like so profound, but he'll say warriors are virtuous because they'll go and they'll face death and they won't be cowardly. So like somebody who had all four but was a warrior would go out to war despite knowing that he may die, and that's not cowardly. It's being virtuous all around. A coward would have four of those things, but when war came and death came crawling, he would run away, making him not virtuous. And this is similar to when life gurus swear by their thing, like where they're saying, you know, my course this, my course that, my this. It's not like the other ones. It's not like this. You're not going to be able to get it by just having my free content. You're not just going to be able to do it by listening to me. You need my course because I need to teach you to have all of it. I can't teach you to have two, three, four. I need you to have two, three, four, five of them in order to get success. Socrates, of course, counters this, and he doesn't understand because to him it doesn't make any sense. Like, it doesn't make any sense to him because he starts saying like stuff like pleasurable and evil, or good and evil, or good and bad, or and stuff like that. And he essentially says people follow what is good for them. They typically wouldn't want to do something that's evil for them. So like one of the examples is when somebody does something that's pleasurable in the moment, but they know long term it's bad. And he uses good and evil, but those words switch to pleasurable and bad, switch to good and evil essentially. So he says if it's pleasurable now, but they know it's bad later. Why did they do it at that moment? And Protagoras tries to counter this by saying that they're not virtuous and they essentially don't know. And Socrates counters this by saying no, they do know. They know that it's good right now, and they're able to indulge in that, and they're just ignorant to the fact that it's bad later, or they're not caring to the fact, they're ignorant to the fact that it'll impact them. And that wraps around back to his whole knowledge of the virtue thing, where he's saying essentially people don't do bad things willingly. They actually do things that they perceive as good willingly. For the example of like the warrior, he thinks going out to war and dying a good death is a good thing to do. It's virtuous for him. It would be bad to be a coward. It would be bad to run away. He's not going to do something that's bad. He wants to do something that's good. Now, for example, me, I mean, telling me to go out to medieval times and go out to war, and I'm like a guy that writes about being virtuous, and you said go out to war and die. No, I think it's very good for me to live on and continue spreading my gospel and studying and learning unless I really felt like I should go out to war and fight for something. So you can't claim that these people are cowardly. They're actually being knowledgeable. They're actually possessing virtue. They're actually doing things that are good for them. So you can't claim that it's bad for them because it actually is good for them. And that's Socrates' point, is that these things aren't actually bad for them. They're good for them, at least to a limited degree. And they do, I think they do. Protagoras starts being cornered, and he kind of just starts agreeing with Socrates because he's making sense and he knows he's making sense. And they start to explain more and more that people do what they think is good, and they never people don't willingly err, or something like that is the quote, is that they don't willingly do evil. And that is a point of contention where people will say, well, what about a murder? What about this or that? And his point is that from their perspective, they're doing something that's good. Even somebody that is mentally unfit to stand trial would be doing something they perceived was good and be aware of it later that it was bad. Because at the time they were ignorant. They were knowledgeable about the fact that at the time they thought it was a good idea, but later it was actually a bad idea. It was pleasurable at the time, but it was bad later. They were ignorant to the fact that it would be bad later, or they knew the fact that it was bad later. That means that's when you're fit to stand trial. You knew it was bad later, but the fact that it was so pleasurable now, you thought it was better than the potential bad, essentially. Or you didn't think that the bad part was actually bad when other people did think that the bad part was actually bad. And this kind of ties around to another work of Plato's where Socrates questions what good deeds are. This is around the time where he was going to stand trial, but he questions how can good deeds be from the gods, or are they intrinsically good? And that's another good question, is because you can't claim that they're intrinsically good, and you can't claim that the gods think they're good, because the gods are all different and vast, and that assumes that good is a sort of dynamic thing that changes upon the gods or God sides. It's good, so it must be intrinsically good, like the actions must be intrinsically good, but that's not a good argument either. So that's another good point. That was a different book though. And this kind of ties around to the end of it. I do think that I skipped kind of a lot of it, but the the essential point is that this courageous thing, courageous ignorance, knowledge, and stuff. Socrates essentially disproves himself and claims that they both are probably being looked at as like crazy people because they argued back and forth just for Socrates to prove Protagoras' point that virtue can be taught, and then he disproves Protagoras' perceived notion that virtue wasn't knowledge and ignorance, which essentially at the end of the book they both start agreeing, and Socrates is like, "Well, I guess ironically solved the problem because virtue is a matter of knowledge and ignorance, and you can teach knowledge and ignorance because teaching virtue is just teaching knowledge. You can actually do that. My bad." And I think that the point that the book is trying to say is that sophists can do well, but they're preying on your money, and they will do as little as they need to do, or they can be very good. But do you need to pay for it when you can have self reflection and critical thinking and learn all of these things and know the truth and search for the truth and just strive to not be ignorant and strive to be knowledgeable? I would willingly watch a life guru stuff and listen to what they're saying just to have the knowledge because I don't want to be ignorant of that perspective, but I also want to know the whole truth. Like when they say hard work is what gets it, but it's majority luck. It's really just luck based. And I will say that working hard can put you into a position to be lucky enough to have the chance to be a super successful person. Yes, but they don't say that. They kind of give you the general idea, but don't want to tell you that because it doesn't sound like what they're trying to sell. And just to wrap it up, it's just to be careful of the modern day sophists. The modern day sophists are these life gurus and these content creators that are selling courses to you that are trying to tell you how to live and trying to tell you how you should have your values in life. When really you should be finding those out on your own. You should be doing the research. You should be thinking your own things. You should be always asking why. A very big thing that happens with me when I'm arguing with, I love arguing with people. When I argue with people, it really shows me a reflection of themselves because there's certain points, and this ties back into another philosopher, Ludwig Wittgenstein, which is my one of my favorite philosophers. He has a book called Uncertainty, and in Uncertainty, he talks about how people have a rooted belief. They have a system of beliefs that kind of align with everything that they believe in, and when you're cracking at that foundation of belief, they can't give that up. If you compromise on that, that shatters you as a person. I've always thought this when I was having arguments with people. I would tell people all the time, I hit a point, and that's a point of no return of you can't admit this. It doesn't matter how much I prove it. It doesn't matter how much it doesn't sound logical. It doesn't matter how illogical it is. You can't say this is the case because it would shatter you. And a lot of the times it happens when you ask people why. A great example of mine is um, people that join the military, at least the ones that I know, I'll say why, and they'll be like, "Well, because it's a good opportunity." I said, "Well, there's other good opportunities." It's like, "Well, the military, though, I'm doing something for my people." And I say, "Well, why is that a value that you have?" And that is a that's a tough question to answer. Why do I have the value of doing things for my country or my people, or feeling like I have a good impact on society? And when I say that, there's an obvious thing of because it's a good thing to do. It's morally good to do. And once I, you know, get the moral thing out of the way and I get everything and I extract it and I kind of minimize it to that, what is that? Why is that value instilled into you? Why is it you that has to provide for society? Why is it you? Why do you think that? Why do you want to do that? Maybe that's a bit of a bad example, but it's a good thought experiments of why do I have these values? Why do I want to get a family? Why do I want to have a car? Why do I want to have credit card debt? Why do I want to pay all these things? Why do I want to be successful? Why do I want to be involved in this? Why do I want all these things? Why do I do these things? Why do I think that? Why? Why is a good question. It's a very good question. Um, and I got a lot of different responses. Like, I want to be productive member of society versus being poor and living off unemployment. I want to do something with my life, which I think that's a fair answer. When I question that, I think it's valid to question why do you want to do something with life? Why do you want to have an impact? What sort of impact do you want? Is this the impact you're looking for? Is this enough? Is there something else? And those sort of questions are very hard to answer because it's a fundamental set of beliefs. I don't want to get too political, but even saying like for more conservative Christian people, like having sex before marriage, and I say, well, why? They'll resort back to the Bible and the teaching of God's, and you keep asking why, and you keep going down the line of reasoning. There's a foundation that they can't break that thing because by breaking that thing, they're breaking their faith to them, and that's hard to do, and I think a lot of the social conditioning, a lot of the things that happen nowadays is a big impact of being influenced by people that raise you or the society you're in or the things that are around you, like social media and things like this. And that is something that people should step away from time to time and look at it from a different perspective and think critically on it and think, why do I think all these things? Am I wrong for thinking these things? What is these things like? Why do I think this way? Why am I hateful? Why do I hate people? Why do I feel like other people are lesser than me? Why do I feel like I can judge somebody just because of where they come from or what they look like or what they do in their own personal time? But ranting a bit here, but at the end of the day, life gurus want something from you. Want your view, likes, they want shares, they want you to talk about it, they want your comment, they want your money, they want something. You have to have that perspective when you go into it. Every YouTuber wants something. I want you to watch this video. I would love to be able to just make videos and do whatever I want. I would love it. I Of course, but I also want you to have the knowledge that's attached to this. You don't have to watch the video in full, and most people probably won't. They're probably just skipping to this. But that that's fine with me. I wanted to get this off my chest and tell it to people that will listen, people that think similarly to me are interested in this. And you should really just come to your own conclusions and be critical and learn to be critical, to have critical thinking, and to not go into a cycle of being so overly skeptic that you start to lose your mind and not being so overly positive that are positive or negative. And it's really about being not being in the center, but knowing a lot of things and not losing your mind over it and stuff like that, and knowing yourself and learning to know yourself and learning to have your own sort of set of values and morals and foundations of beliefs that you're able to compromise on. Some things that I can't compromise on is like human rights, but I think that's a good line for me to draw in the sand. So, cap it all off. Be wary of the modern day sophists, life gurus, motivational speakers, the content creators. Actually, I think the content creators are more, like, you can do this too, which I do fully believe that. I feel like that's a good message to spread. So maybe not so much content creators or like the streamers, but when they're trying to sell you a course, when they're trying to tell you how to be successful, how to make a business, how to do this, this, and that, and things like that, be careful. And this goes for any side of political spectrum or anything like that. It's any extreme or it's anything. They all generally want something. Thanks for tuning in. There was a lot of ranting. This was the first time I did it semi-scripted. I had wrote this a bit, and I feel like I skipped over a little bit in the middle of the book. But regardless, thanks for tuning in.